Hi, good morning everybody. Any questions about the engines before we get started into flight control hydraulics? Alrighty. As promised, before we dump off into flight control hydraulics, I want to bring back up this component from utility hydraulics. What was this? PCM, good answer. Pressure control module. It's two solenoid valves back here in the back part. What were they? The engine start solenoid valves. They are normally closed, electrically open when we energize the engine start switch. The solenoid valve that I have broken off here, there are 4 switches that will affect this valve. Which 4 switches are they? Blank stares. 3 days ago, we talked about this. That's a long time ago. That's why I like to review it. All right, one of them would be a number 1 PTU. The number 2 PTU. Center cargo hook and the winch. Along with that solenoid valve, you have a pressure operated valve that works in conjunction with that one. Then this solenoid valve right here. One switch, but it will affect 3 systems. Power steering, swivel locks, and the brakes. And then the last solenoid valve, we can control the fluid flow to what? The ramp. Little switch here on the side, called the pressure switch. What does this pressure switch do? Ooh. What light on the master caution panel will this light? Utility hydraulic system light. 1800 psi, that light should come on your master caution panel. 2300 psi, that light should go out. On the bottom, there's a little silver thing. What is it called? Well, I should have went slower the other day. Pressure transmitter. What will this do for me? It'll take a fluid pressure reading, turn it into electrical signal, and send it where? To a gauge on the maintenance panel. Filter button on bottom's pop. What do? Reset it. Crank the APU. And motor the engine for 30 seconds. Okay. What is this? The return control module. The cylinder on top is what?
Transfer cylinder to the ramp.
Transfer cylinder for the ramp operations, the extra fluid needed for that. There's a button here on top. What is this button?
APU.
APU motor button. When will it pop? When excessive flow of 1 gallon per minute goes through the case drain on APU motor / pump, then this button will pop, giving us a filter change light. A button on the side. Utility pump, same thing. Case drain exceeds 1 gallon per minute. Button will pop. The impending bypass light on the maintenance panel will illuminate. Land as soon as practicable. Then again, return filter on the bottom. Button pops, same as the one on the pressure control module. Push the button back in, crank the APU, and motor the engine for 30 seconds. So, may have to review those again tomorrow. Make sure we get them all down pat. Remember what all those solenoids are about. All right, we're going to jump off into the flight control hydraulic system. A lot of the components are going to be the same, so we'll see a little bit of redundancy here. The 2 flight control systems are hydraulically separated, which means there's no way that if I spring a leak in the number 2 system, that the number 1 system will drain out through that leak. They will not mix, then they will not bleed off into each other at any time. But they are electrically integrated. Throughout this process today, I will talk about the electrical integration. TLO for today. Describe the components, operational characteristics, functions, emergency procedures, and limitations of the CH-47 Delta Flight Control Hydraulic System. in a classroom, giving your student handout. And again, on the test that we have Monday, there will be 10 questions come out of this portion of the hydraulics. Safety requirements are none, risk assessment's low, environmental considerations are none. And you've got to receive a go on this portion of the test to receive a go on the overall test. Learning step activity number 1, describe the flight control hydraulic system. We're going to go through and show you where everything's at, then we're going to come back and talk about it. Again, a busy slide. Everything on my slide indicated in red is the number 1 system. Everything in yellow is the number 2 system. They are identical, same components in both locations. They are interchangeable. Looking at my slide, pick either the number 1 power control module or the number 2 power control module. Fluid is going to come out in one point. How many different places does that fluid look like it goes to? How many?
I said 4.
You said 4. Do I hear any other numbers? Boo, 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 boo. I hear 8. The answer could be 5 or it could be 6. According to my slide, it is 5. It will go out and split off and go to all 4 upper dual boost actuators. We want 3,000 PSI going to our upper dual boost actuators at all times, don't we? Without those upper dual boost actuators, we are not going to move the flight controls. The 5th place that it will go to is it's going to go to the little part with a large name, lower control pressure control module. From the lower control pressure control module, then it will split off into 2 portions. One to your boost portion of your ILCA, which where we cannot control the flow of fluid. We want 1,500 PSI going to that side of our ILCAs at all time. The other side will be to our extensible links to unlock those for our AFCS to work. That one we can control, and I will show you how we do that today. The other place that it really does not show on here where the fluid goes to from my power control modules is after the system is online, it maintains that 60 PSI of head pressure on the back side of our reservoir so that we're sucking fluid, not air. A couple of things that we'll talk about today is this flight control switch. At what point do we ever touch this switch?
Pre-flight, that's it.
Not during pre-flight. During the run-up, during your flight control travel and hydraulics check, when you're turning one system off, seeing that the controls move with the opposite system, and then you go back and switch them the other way. That should give you a warm, fuzzy feeling that I can move the controls on the ground with one PTU running. So if any of my transmission-driven pumps fail, I can always have a backup with my PTUs. I stress at what point, because is there an emergency procedure that tells me to go up and grab that switch? There's not. But I have to show you the electrical integration today, and that's some part of where that electrical integration takes place. It will not allow you, if you think you are a good pilot and are going to troubleshoot the system in a way that it should not be troubleshot, if my number 1 power control module springs a leak, and I think I'm going to reach up there and shut the number 1 off, and I accidentally shut number 2 off, it will not allow me to select a bad system. It is a fail-safe operation. I'm going to explain it to you, and I'm going to emphasize it again over and over and over. There is no emergency procedure that we ever reach up there and touch that switch. Another switch we will talk about is the AFCS selector switch. When I reach down there and I turn number 1 on, what did I do to number 2? How? How did I turn number 2 off? Because I removed the hydraulics. I didn't do anything with electricity. That number 2 AFCS computer will always remain on, and it's going to know where the aircraft is at. It's going to know what attitude it's in, so that when I turn number 2 back on, it's not trying to find out where we were at before versus where we are at now and start putting the aircraft in unusual attitudes. Any questions about this slide?
Where does it turn it off at?
Where does it turn it off at? It will turn it off. We'll talk about the lower control pressure control module a little bit later on, but there's a solenoid valve on it, and that's where it will deprive the extensible links of that 1500 PSI. And when you did your AFCS class, Tom talked about the authority covers and that little spring in the back. That's all we're doing with hydraulic fluid is unlocking that spring when we turn it on. And then your inputs are electrical from there. Number one flight control components in a nutshell in the forward transmission area. Starts out in our reservoir, then we'll go to our PTU, our power transfer units. From our power transfer units, it will go to the power control module. Again, not a pressure control module. They've taken the pressure control module, the return control module, and put them into one component. We do not have all those solenoid valves where we can control the flow of fluid in this one. So it made it easier to make one component out of it. From the power control module, then it will go out to your upper dual boost actuators, and then it will go to your lower control pressure control module. Which upper dual boost actuator would that one be? Do we remember? Pivoting. How did you tell that? That's a good way to do it. It's on the pilot side. P for pivoting, P for pilot. And the back, it's backwards. I've got a slide here in a moment to show you the difference of the actuators. There is the number 2 flight control components. That is the number 2 engine. Power control module, power transfer unit, and on the opposite side of the aft pylon, there is a small reservoir on the other side. This is that same panel removed on the number 1 side of the aft pylon, and you can see the reservoir sitting right there. The reservoir cooler modules, I just pointed out where those were both at. The biggest difference between this one and the utility system that you can see right now before we start talking about it is just the size. There will be one other difference. Power transfer units, number 1 up front, number 2 in the back. They allow us that 3,000 PSI for engine startup, moving our flight controls. When we come back and we shut down, it allows us to have flight control maneuverability, and there are backups for in-flight emergencies. Power control modules, return filter, pressure filter. They will also have that case drain, the pump, impending pump fault button on top of those. We'll show you that. And then my hydraulic pumps. A pump's a pump's a pump. Whether it's a utility pump or a flight control pump, they're all the same. If I look them up in the parts manual, the same part number, same stock number. It's just a matter of where they're located at and what lines are hooked up to them. But they will produce how much PSI? 3,000 PSI, variable flow rate of 0 to 16.5. And then there is that little component that I was talking about a while ago in the flight control closet. Lower control, pressure control module. The number 1 is located in the back. As you're standing in the companionway looking in the flight control closet, it's behind the OCAs. That little ducking right there is for the vent for the avionics closet. The number 2, that is on the front side of the flight control closet, station 95, the bulkhead where you go into the cockpit, located there. And that is the solenoid valve on the bottom of it. When we select that AFCS selector switch to 1, 2, or whatever, whichever one we turn it off, that's where we're depriving the OCAs of the hydraulic fluid. There's our upper dual boost actuators. There are 4 of them, pivoting and swiveling. They operate off of how many PSI? Say it with confidence. You were right the first time. 3,000 PSI. The P for pivoting, again, if you look at it one way, there's one of those ears will form a P, and P for pilot. The swiveling actuator will have one mount bolt in the middle of it, allowing it to swivel back and forth. The actions of both of them, the way they are, will prevent the swash plate from ever locking up when you're going up and down and putting the controls in unusual positions. The way that they're designed, they will prevent it from locking up. Got your jam indicator buttons on top. Treat those kind of like filter buttons. If they're popped, try to reset it, cycle the controls through. But do not do any fast movements. Do not try to put any roll and yaw and pull up on the thrust all at the same time. Take one quadrant at a time and move the controls through smoothly and slowly. If they stay in, they're good to go. If they pop, then probably going to have to replace the actuators. The integrated lower control actuator manifold. Oh, they've stolen my ILCA off my slide. Your ILCAs, when they are mounted into the flight control closet, you've got 4 of them, you've got 2 of these manifolds. On the ILCAs, you had those funnel-shaped little tubes on the sides of them. Remember those? I'll pull one out during a break and show you. But those tubes will line up with these O-rings and these fittings here. The ILCAs will slide on and be mounted, and that's how it gets the hydraulic fluid from the system into the ILCAs. Because you haven't seen any lines, hydraulic lines, on the side of the ILCAs like there used to be in the Charlie model. And then there is our ILCAs, 4 of them, in the flight control closet. Pitch, roll, and yaw will have the extensible links, thrust will not. Sources of system pressure. In the utility system, there were 4 sources of pressure. Now then there will be 3. You've got your transmission-driven pumps, you've got your power transfer units, and then we have our AGPU. Same for the number 2 system. Pumps are just located in a different place. And then there again, there's our AGPU. Provides us with utility pressure, flight control, hydraulic pressure, DC power, and AC power. Hydraulic fluid. Now this may sound simple, especially to an AQC class. And I don't know if I've emphasized the importance of making sure that when we put hydraulic fluid or fluid in any place, we make sure we're putting the right stuff. When we use hydraulic fluid in the CH-47, we should be using that 83282. That's our fire-resistant hydraulic fluid. 5606 is an alternative. If we put it in there, then we've got to write it up, let them flush it. 5606 is non-fire retardant, 83282 is. I point this out because if you see people servicing something, especially when we start talking about the rudder head, when you take hydraulic fluid and you mix it with one of the other oils, whether it be 23699, which is engine oil, 7808, which is transmission fluid, or transmission oil, which goes in the rotor head. If I mix hydraulic fluid with them, it will gel. And there are places, the hydraulic systems are pressurized. It will gel and it will cause problems. But when we put it into places that it doesn't belong, if I put hydraulic fluid in this reservoir right here and it starts to gel, there are transfer tubes with no pressure. It will look full, but the oil is not getting to where it needs to be. So be cautious. When you see people servicing things, try to keep it in your mind what should be there. Hydraulic fluid is red, 23699. Engine oil is green, 7808 is silver. Then we got what we call Barney oil is in a purple can. That's for our transmissions also. Any questions so far? The normal position for the flight control switch is both. Again, I can't emphasize this enough. Don't troubleshoot it and move it from there. The lower control pressure control module reduces pressure from 3,000 to 1,500 for the boost portion of the ILCA and the extensible link portion of the ILCA. All right, let's start talking about some of the components. Start talking about the reservoirs. Flight control reservoir. That one even has a good cooler on top. Utility hydraulic reservoir. You can see there is quite a difference in the sizes. There's one without reservoir. So there is a difference in the sizes. Now I said there were 2 differences. One of them you can see. I don't have any ex-mechanics in here, so I shouldn't ask that question. The other difference is, remember what we did to keep 60 psi on the back side of this when the engines were not running? What did we?
Reservoir pressure something.
Utility reservoir pressurization accumulator. Have I mentioned anything yet about an accumulator in this system? Or the bootstrap? No, I haven't mentioned one. What they did to maintain that 60 psi with the system offline is put a spring inside of it. We had to cut this one in half to get it out. It's a very large spring. To have put a spring inside this one to make it work, it would have been too large. The pressure would have made the reservoir come apart. This spring is supposed to fit in this little area right here, because there's your visual level indicator telling you how much fluid's in there. Fluid would be on this side. This spring is supposed to fit inside there. So that's what maintains that 60 psi on it. Those are the two differences. Showing a picture of my spring there. Our cooler, remembering from what we talked about Monday, is the cooler bypassable? If my cooler gets clogged, will it bypass?
Yes.
Okay, now then, that's what I was looking for. It will bypass. There is no thermostat on it, but if it gets clogged, it will bypass. It will not go into the cooler, it will dump straight into the reservoir. Hopefully using some of the fluid that's inside the reservoir to cool off what we're dumping in there until whatever made it bypass goes away. If it was viscosity, as soon as it warms up, the bypass will close and it will allow it to be cooled off by the cooler again. Visual fluid level indicator, the little green band on the back. You should be able to see that green band when you pre-flight. It's telling us that it's full. Linear variable differential transducer. What does that do for me, or for you, or for the flight engineer? Anybody flying that aircraft?
Just the level.
Tells us a level. Where does it? How does it do that?
Based on how far out the plunger is.
Okay. The LVDT is located right there again. It's the little rod. The further out, the less resistance. The further in, more resistance. Turn it into an electrical signal, sending it where? To the maintenance panel.
Which of the filters don't have the bypass? There's one without a bypass.
This filters, well, this was the one I was talking about with the cooler, not a filter. But on the filters, to be like the pressure and the utility system, the pressure side.
I think one of the coolers, we had it yesterday or the day before or something.
On the engine?
Yeah, that's where you're gonna say, that's what we're talking about.
Pressure versus
The pressure side of it doesn't have a bypass.
Yeah, okay. Then on the utility system, the pressure, just like this too also, on the pressure side, there is no bypass on the filter. On the return side, there is. Bleed relief valve. Again, one of those little things that if you touch it, or if I tell you that it moves, you want to go touch it. What does the bleed relief valve, try to remember what we talked about Friday, what does it do for me?
Lets air out manually and relieves at overpressure of oil.
Okay. I can bleed air manually, I can bleed it out of it, and it will prevent overpressurization. 100 psi, it will start opening. A little bit above 100 psi, it will bleed it out. And we can take oil sample or fluid samples, hydraulic fluid samples from here. In the utility system, as long as I held this lever down and there was pressure in the system, it would bleed out. In the flight control system, for some unknown reason, there will be enough shoot of it out for us to get our sample. But other than that, that one little squirt, you can hold this one down all day long and it won't do anything. So you won't be able to get your stick buddy wet with that one. There's the cooler bypass valve. Temperature bulb. What did my temperature bulb do for me in the utility system? converts the fluid signal, the temperature of the signal in the fluid from the reservoir as it's being dumped into the reservoir. After it goes through the cooler, it goes over this temp bulb, tells us what the temperature is, it sends it to a gauge on the maintenance panel. Temperature switch. What did the temp switch do in the utility system? Turns something off and turns something on. Turns the cooler fan. At what temperatures? 63 and 54. Again, the power of 9. And then our 2 cooler fans, number 1 flight control hydraulic cooler fan, located in that what we call the doghouse cowling on the forward pylon. There is a former that's about halfway down. You'll see the cooler fan attached to it, attached to the other end of the flex. When you get with Tom and you start talking about transmissions, you will find out that in this aircraft, we are managing the flow of air. In the past, in the other aircraft, we just only cared that it cooled components down. Now then, we have these things placed where we would like for them. We control the flow of air and keep things cool. The number 2 hydraulic cooler fan, again located in the aft pylon. When you open the clamshell doors up, that first shelf that you see about eye level, the first fan we see, the larger fan should be the utility hydraulic fan. The number 2 fan should be the smaller one, the second one you see. On my slide, you can see the number 1 system cooler fan gets it from the number 1 AC and DC buses, and the number 2 from the number 2 AC and DC buses. Again, this will be a time when you start thinking about emergency procedures. If I have an emergency procedure and do not have a bus tie or a cross tie, this is why I'm landing. One of these fans will not be operating. Hydraulic fluid gets hot, it's not a good thing. Our hydraulic pumps, located on the forward transmission and in which side of the aft transmission?
Left.
Left-hand side of the aft transmission. Same pump. This is the one we had in the utility class. I can take it apart. The insides are all the same. They will deliver as long as the rotors are turning. They will deliver that 3,000 psi constantly. A variable flow rate of 0 to 16.5. Again, it will be accomplished by if there's not any demand on the system, the back pressure will build back up on the wobble plate, pushing the wobble plate up. If I can't suck hydraulic fluid, then I can't pump hydraulic fluid. And that's how that, again, that's how that's accomplished. Case drain that's on there will do what for me on these pumps?
Drains more than a gallon will pop out.
You're in
Will oil your system to pump.
You're on the right track. If 1 gallon per minute of excess fluid starts flowing out of this through the case drain, the power control module at this time will pick that up, pop a button, and tell us that we've got a impending pump failure. Power control modules. I'm lost. Oh, there it is. Here's the power control module. Again, PCM. Some of the components that are on the power control module are filters, return filter, pressure filter. Pressure filter's non-bypassable, return filter is bypassable. Again, if the pressure side starts getting clogged and that 3,000 psi cannot find its way through, there will be other symptoms. There'll be a high pressure on the maintenance panel. You should start developing leaks in other places. It will manifest itself in other ways before it becomes a big problem. Differential pressure indicator buttons, if they pop, we reset those, crank the APU, and this time we will do what?
Motor cycle.
Okay, motor and the engines will do it for me in the utility system, what do I need to do in the flight control system? Cycle the flight controls smoothly and evenly. If it stays in, you're good to go. If they pop out, replace the filter. Along with the filter button popping, when it pops, it will activate these switches, which in turn will activate a light on the maintenance panel, the filter change lights. Accumulator. We did not have an accumulator in the utility hydraulic system. There is a 12.5-inch accumulator in the middle of this one. An accumulator, I know if I was to ask what an accumulator does, I'd probably get the answer that it accumulates. An accumulator usually dampens out surges, and it will help when a system is overloaded. It will give you that extra boost of power that you are needed. There's a little surge that's needed in the system for a pump to keep up. We will talk about this a little bit more when we talk about our PTUs, because when we're using our PTUs, this accumulator really works, and it works hard. And we will explain why and how that it works. This is the chart out of the back of the Dash 10. Anytime that we're playing with accumulators and we need to find out what the pre-charge on them should be, you go to the Dash 10 or the back of your checklist. You find out what the temperature is. An average day down here, I would assume somewhere around 80, 82 degrees. Draw a line straight up. Where it intersects those lines coming across, the dark heavy lines, draw a line straight out. Any given time on most of our accumulators, anywhere between 1,300 and 1,500 is where the pre-charge should fall. You fall out of those ranges, I would suggest that you take a look at the temperature and take a look at the chart to make sure that we are within our range for that day. Pressure switch. See if I can get one. That won't come out. What did the pressure switch do for me on the pressure control module in the utility system? Turn the light on. All right, this one's going to work a little bit harder. Here's the pressure switch. What page have I accumulated to now? Page 13. Accumulator of the pressure switch. Okay. This one is going to do three things for me. It's going to activate the light on the master caution panel, telling me that I've lost pressure when it drops below 1800 psi. It is also going to send a signal and cut off that corresponding AFCS system. If I have no pressure on that side, hydraulic-wise, then the AFCS is not going to work. It's going to allow that ILCA for that side, for that number one or number two system to go back and lock. And then, last but not least, this is my little fail-safe thing. This is what prevents me from selecting a bad system if I feel like I'm going to try to troubleshoot the aircraft when I shouldn't be. So it turns on the corresponding master caution light for the corresponding system. Turns off the corresponding AFCS and giving me an AFCS light, and it prevents me from turning off a good system. I will show you a little bit later on. I'll get over there on the board and show you how that is accomplished. Again, to emphasize that I'm going to show you how that works. I show you the electrical integration, but we do not have an emergency procedure for that. Pilot solenoid valve. When I reach on that overhead control switch and I turn off a system, pilot solenoid valve is going to receive the signal, and it's normally closed and electrically open. The solenoid valve is going to work a little bit different than other valves. When I open this solenoid valve up, I'm allowing hydraulic fluid to flow through this pressure operated valve. At that time, that hydraulic fluid is going to push a spring in this pressure operated valve, closing it, stopping the flow of hydraulic fluid to the whatever system I have selected. This winds up being a fail-safe system. Again, if I lose electrical power, I cannot control this pilot solenoid valve, then it's going to close, closing the flow of hydraulic fluid to this, allowing it to open back up. You're going to have to read your student handout there a couple of times to understand when they're electrically closed. Let's see. Normally open, electrically closed. Normally closed, electrically open, I'm sorry. And then that valve is open and hydraulically closed. But that is our fail-safe system. Hopefully when I draw it on the board here shortly, we'll make a lot more sense out of it. Then our pressure transmitter does the same thing that it did on our pressure control module. And that is what? Takes the pressure signal, turns it into an electrical signal, transmits it to my maintenance panel. Pump fault indicator. Again, the case drain on the pump. If it exceeds 1 gallon per minute, then it will pop this button, giving us a pump fault light, telling us it's time to change it. Let's take us about a 10-minute break and we'll come back and talk about the lower control pressure control module. Are there any questions about anything we've covered up until now? Lower control pressure control module. A little part with a big name. This is where we control the flow of hydraulic fluid to our ILCAs. Pressure in, 3,000 psi. And again, there's nothing in the flight control closet that operates off of 3,000 psi. So the first thing we've got to do is reduce that pressure. On the top portion of it, at the top, is a pressure reducer. This reduces the pressure coming out of our power control modules from 3,000 down to 1,500 psi, going to our boost portion of our ILCAs at all times, we hope. There's the 1,500 psi going in and out. Again, this is pressure that we cannot control. We want that going to our boost portion all times. The other side, to the extensible link, we can control. So they gave us a pilot solenoid valve located on the bottom. This is the solenoid valve that we activate or deactivate when we are moving the AFCS selector switch on the Canon console. Taking away power or putting power to it to deprive or give the extensible link portion its hydraulic fluid. 1,500 psi coming out when we open the solenoid valve, going to our extensible links. Unlocking that lock, the spring that's inside there that lock the extensible links. When we shut off that 1,500 psi, we've got to have a place for the hydraulic fluid to go. So if we're not using it to operate the ILCA's extensible link side, we shut it off, then we've got a return side to back to our power control module. Goes to our power control module, then back into the reservoir. Any questions about the lower control pressure control module? Our power transfer units, and this can be confusing, and we'll try to keep it as simple as we can. Looking at my slide, this one is the one in the forward pylon. There is a utility side, there is a motor on it, and then there's a flight control side, there's a pump. Looking at my slide, which side would that have would be the utility side? The motor side. Because it might be something an IP might ask you. All right, I hear most of everybody saying it is on the left side, and you are correct. I always look for the little blue plug on the top. That is my utility side. The side that has all the lines coming out of it, that will be our flight control side, because we are using the utility as a motor, driving the pump on the flight control side to produce our flight control pressure. Again, this is probably 80% utility hydraulics, but we are teaching it in the flight control system because we use the utility hydraulic system to produce flight control pressure for engine startup, for in-flight emergencies, and for engine shutdown. The pump itself is capable of producing 3,000 psi. Small pump, a lot smaller than the large transmission-driven pump. The biggest difference is the flow rate. It has a flow rate of 3.5 gallons per minute. It does not have that variable where it goes up and it goes down. Therefore, it gives us a warning in our dash 10 about moving our controls rapidly. You may feel binding in the upper dual boost actuators. You're going to hear something like a cat whining. This feels like a cat's caught in a flight control closet, because this pump is screaming and doing everything it can to keep up with your demands. Once I say it's trying to keep up with your demands, if it cannot keep up with your demands, this is where this accumulator really comes into effect. If I'm flying along or I'm using this during engine startup and I make rapid control inputs, if that pump cannot keep up, the 3,000 psi of pressure that's in this accumulator on the power control module, that's what it's there for. That 3,000 psi will jump into the system and take up until the pump can catch up. A little surge of pressure that it needs, this accumulator will push it in the system, then the pump will catch up, recharge my accumulator, then we're back into business again. Talk about some of the components that are on it. Pilot solenoid valve, located on the bottom. Normally closed, electrically open. When will I open that pilot solenoid valve? Simple question.
You make input.
No. When I turn the PTU switch on. Okay. Now then, we're going to try to say this talk about this without confusing everyone. I reach up on the overhead control switch. I've got the APU online. Next step would be turn on a power transfer unit. Your checklist does not tell you which one to turn on. You can turn on number 1 or number 2, whichever one comes first. With that first switch I throw, how many pilot solenoid valves will I activate? Think about the utility system. I've got to use utility pressure.
2, 1 on the utility, 1 on that one.
Good shot. 2, the first switch I throw, first PTU switch I throw, I will activate this switch right here. Okay, I've just released, well, in our case right now we're doing engine startup. I've just released 3350 psi of pressure. It went to 4 places. It went to my number 1 PTU, my number 2 PTU, my center cargo hook, and my winch. All 4 of those have an additional solenoid valve on the outside of them, waiting for you to hit another switch to let the flow of fluid go through that component. But with the first PTU switch I turned on, I activated 2 solenoid valves. The one on the pressure control module, and then the one on the corresponding PTU. This one right here. When I open this one right here, there's also a pressure actuated valve, slow to open valve, that will keep the hydraulic fluid at a slow pace to get this motor turning. Okay, now that I've got the first PTU online, I turn on the second PTU. How many pilot solenoid valves at that time did I open up? Just 1. The pilot solenoid valve on the bottom of that corresponding PTU. That 3350 psi pressure was sitting outside the second PTU, waiting for me to open up that solenoid valve, allowing the fluid to flow through it. Was that said simple enough for everybody to understand? Same if I'm flying along and I'm using the transmission-driven pumps and I arm the center cargo hook. I've got the 3350 or 3000 psi sitting in front of both PTUs, sitting up there waiting for me to hit my cargo release switch or waiting for me to arm my winch, either way. But the first one of those 4 components, I activate that switch on the pressure control module and a solenoid valve on that corresponding component. Y'all did good on that one. Pressure operated valve, again, allows the flow of fluid because there's a motor involved to begin moving the motor slowly. There is two parts of it. There's a motor side and a pump side. We've already identified which one is which. And then we've talked about the power transfer switches, talked about which ones they activated. I'm going to draw on the board our electrical integration. My art's not that well, but hopefully we can get this to where we can explain or understand the electrical integration. PCM, power control module. PS is going to be my pressure switch, pilot solenoid valve, and then my pressure operated valve. This will be the number 1. Oops. Okay. Some of the basics about how electricity works. We know that we've got to have a positive and we've got to have a negative to make the connection flow and make anything open or close like we want it to. When I reach up on my overhead panel and I select the number 1 switch on, when I pull it down, I am sending the positive side of my electricity to the number 2 pilot solenoid valve. I want this pilot solenoid valve to open up to allow hydraulic fluid to go to this pressure operated valve to close. I want to close off the flow of fluid into my number 1 system. To complete the circuit, the pilot solenoid valve has to have the negative. The negative will come from the opposite system's pressure switch. Remember I said that pressure switch does 3 things for us. Turns on the corresponding hydraulic fluid light or hydraulic system light, turns off our AFCS and it turns on the AFCS light and prevents me from selecting a bad system. So when I turned this, it went to the positive side of it. It sent a signal out and said, okay, number 1 system, do I have 1800 PSI? As long as I've got 1800 PSI, this pressure switch knows that and is supplying the ground. The next time you go out and you do your controls check, this is the sequence that you do. You usually reach up there and you'll turn number 1 on. You'll hear the flight engineer in the back say, pressure's up on 1, down on 2. As you are moving the controls, if you start to move them rapidly, you'll hear a clicking noise in the back. Because probably what had happened under the number 1 system that you're operating on, that pump only being able to keep up with so much because of the flow rate, dropped below 1800 PSI. When it dropped below 1800 PSI, that negative went away, temporarily allowing this valve to close and then allowing this system to come back online. Enough said, easy said.
Yeah, but then once you see the light going on and off on the panel.
You should see what would happen. The light for this one would come on, this light would go off. And it's going to be quick. You may not see it. It's going to happen so quick. But that's usually when you can tell if this switch is operating. Well, actually, by turning number 1 on, if number 2 goes off, it's operating correctly. But that's how you can see it in action. If you move the controls very rapidly, this one will drop below 1800 PSI. This one will come back on. That's just a fail-safe mode so that if for some reason or another I did have the number 2 system offline, I lost all my generators or all my electrical power, then this fail-safe is going to allow this to open back up and hydraulic fluid's going to go through. It takes pressure on the opposite system to be able to close the system that you want to close or turn off. Did I confuse everybody? Hope not, because we're all inspiring to be IPs one day, and when you come back to be an IP, that's about a 15-minute class you got to give. But there are the systems again. So what did the pressure switch do for me? What does the pressure switch do for you as a pilot?
Turns on the corresponding light.
Turns on the corresponding light,
Turns off the corresponding AFCS and turns that light on.
turns off the corresponding AFCS and turns that light on,
Provides a ground for the opposite.
and provides a ground, keeping you from turning off a good system. Any questions about that? It will come in time, I promise you. The maintenance panel. Flight control pressures. What are the flight control pressures?
25 to 32. 25 to 30.
I hear a lot of questions in that. We'll do 25 to 32.
Utilities, 25 to 35.
Yeah, the utilities 25 to 35. Temperatures.
95 to 120, 120 max.
95 to 120, 120 max. And again, the same applies with this as it did in the utility hydraulic system. If they come over the intercom and they tell you the temperature is riding at 80 degrees, don't blow it off. Something's wrong. Because my cooler fan kicks on when? 63. Our reservoir gets its reading from LVDT. This one, there is only one gauge. There are two systems. You must, as long as the battery's plugged in, I can press the level check gauge, and whichever system that I have selected with the toggle switch will come up and tell me whether it's full or I need to add on that system. Then I flip the switch to the opposite system and it will tell me the fluid level reading for that system also. Again, these are good things to check. If you're the one pre-flighting up top, check them before you go up and look at your visual level indicator on your reservoir to make sure they correspond. Filter change lights. Filter button pops on the power control module. It will trigger the filter change transmitter, giving us the lights on our maintenance panel. Pump fault lights. I know I've asked that a million times and everybody by now knows 1 gallon per minute out of my case drain, it will activate my pump fault lights. They may fail in 5 minutes, they may fail in 5 years. Hydraulic system fill module. We talked about it in a utility hydraulics class. Do we need to talk any more about this? When can I add fluid to the system? Anytime, in flight or on the ground. What does a pump fault light on the maintenance panel indicate? We just went over that. What are the three functions of the #1 power control pressure switch? I want to make sure everybody's got this. Say it again.
I didn't read that in the student handout.
Okay, student handout.
Is that exact order?
Starts on page 13.
Yep. The pressure switch on page 13, bow legs number 8, says it controls the corresponding light. Tells you when the lights come off and on. And then B, it provides its respective ground to the AFCS computer, which gives us the light and tells that lower control pressure control module deprive the extensible link portion of hydraulic fluid. And then bow legs number C provides a ground for the opposite system's pilot solenoid valve. And without that ground, I cannot turn off the opposite system. All right, flying along again, fat, dumb, and happy. Master caution light illuminates. You look down on your master caution panel and you've got these two lights. Keep in mind, I will never get that light without getting that light. I can have that light and there's an emergency procedure for it. But I will never, ever, ever get a hydraulic number 1 or hydraulic number 2 light without the corresponding AFCS, because that AFCS is not going to work without hydraulic pressure. What should I do when I get those lights? Fluid loss is evident. Fluid loss is not evident. Land as soon as possible, power transfer switch on the affected system on, maintenance panel monitor. Well, number 2, why do you think that the first step is land as soon as possible?
Make sure you have full control of the aircraft.
We're going to get in control of the aircraft and we want to get it into a landing descent or landing attitude. When I turn on power transfer switch number 1 or 2, power is not restored. And then all of a sudden I get the other lights and power is not restored. I already have the aircraft in a landing attitude, because I'm here to tell you, if you lose both flight control systems, you're not going to move the controls. They're going to freeze where they're at, and hopefully you can get it to the ground one way or the other. If high fluid temperature is evident, land as soon as possible. Both lights.
Transfer switch as soon as possible.
Now this one, hopefully we're not dying, but this one is a bad scenario. I have not heard of this ever happening, but this one, instead of landing as soon as possible, we're trying to get both switches on, try to get both PTUs online. Hopefully, if we can get any pressure out of them, again, now we're going to put the aircraft in that landing descent or landing attitude and then start landing as soon as possible. Because I'm telling you, if you lose whatever you've got there for pressure, those controls are probably going to stay where they're at until you put it on the ground. Our pump fault lights. The Dash 10 is new to you guys, but when they had to change, they incorporated this. This was not an emergency procedure prior to 30 June of this year. Pump fault light comes on, land as soon as practical. Maintenance panel monitor, and they're looking for vibrations or temperatures. What warning is to be observed when moving the flight controls using PTU pressure?
Not to make rapid inputs.
Not to be putting in the rapid inputs. Again, what is the pressure off of my PTU pump? How many PSI?
3,000.
What's the flow rate? 3.5 on this one. This one will not increase or decrease that flow rate, 3.5. That is why you'll get binding in the controls at some point. Any questions about anything we've covered today? I mean, that appears to kind of be a quick class, but I think we covered everything. Does everybody understand about the electrical integration? We know when we touch that overhead control switch. When do we do that? During run-up. There is not an emergency procedure that allows us to reach up there and touch that switch. So as we become better pilots, don't think I'm going to beat the system and do that.